Okay, I'd like to get going here because we have a wonderful panel and we don't want to cheat you out of even 2 minutes of this. So I'm going to go very quickly here to do the introductions one at a time and the speakers one at a time. And these are all speakers I know quite well, but I'll give you their formal introductions anyway. So Terrence Deacon, University of California, Berkeley. Terry is an American neuroanthropologist. He taught at Harvard University, Boston University, and he's currently the professor of anthropology and member of the cognitive science faculty at the University of California, Berkeley. His research combines human evolutionary biology and neuroscience with the goal of investigating the evolution of human cognition. He's written two very interesting books, quite long, but very interesting. I always tease him about that. Took me 2 weeks to read one of them. It's called The Symbolic Species, the Coevolution of Language and the Brain, and Incomplete Nature, How Mind Emerges from Matter. Wow, how about that? So Terry is also my closest colleague on the project I'm in charge of at Stanford University called The Boundaries of Humanity. Humans, Animals, and Machines in the Age of Biotechnology, and we're co-sponsoring this fall conference. So Terry's right in line with what we're doing. Terry.
So to make this work, I have to stop this. There we go. And here. Seamless. Seamless. All right. What I'm going to talk about personhood, but in this case, something that I'm very interested in, and I'll try to lead to it quickly, and that is how we are not persons, how we're part of a larger person. And hopefully it'll make sense as I move through this. Yes, very good. All right, so from a biological point of view, all individuals, except for the very, very smallest, are societies of individuals, sort of Russian dolls kind of thing. What I want to do, however, is not, even though I'm a biologist, a neurobiologist by training, but I want to talk about it from the point of view of communication and mind. To do that, I want to do a little evolutionary history very, very quickly. I'm going to actually skip most of the neuroscience that I had thought I was going to put in here, but you don't want to hear that anyway. And to talk about animal communication, in part because animal communication has a lot in common across species, and across mammals, across birds, across lots of other species. And most of the communication is about emotional states, arousal states, what the animal is about to do, typically is a way to do it, or what it's responding to in terms of physiological effects. I've become very much interested, of course, as an anthropologist as well, as to how people are different, and they're different particularly in the way we communicate. And I'm going to talk about three modes of communication known from the semiotic field, called iconic, indexical, and symbolic communication. Symbolic communication we're much more familiar with is, of course, the communication I'm engaged in now. And that is in which the sign vehicles, the sounds that I'm using, the words I'm showing you, have no relationship to what they actually refer to. Whereas icons are referenced by virtue of likeness, and indices by virtue of their correlation with something else. So a fever, for example, is an indication, an index of a fever. One of my favorite Far Side cartoons, if you can see it here, here's Dr. Schwartzman. Dr. Schwartzman has put on his animal decoder hat to find out what dogs are actually saying, and they're all saying, hey, 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 hey. The key, of course, is that they're communicating indexically, for the most part. That is as to what their emotional arousal state is about, and so on. The challenge is that icons and indices, we pretty much know what they mean right away. When we look at the paintings on cave walls, we pretty much have an idea what they depict, but we have no idea what they are about symbolically, if they have a symbolic meaning. And that's because the symbols don't carry any affordance to help you interpret it, unless you know the special codes. The only thing that holds them together and holds us together is that we share this sort of interpretive habit. We all in this room share at least an interpretive habit with respect to English. I think this transition was a major inflection point in human evolution. I'll just read the slides as I go to be quick. Human cognition is unique because of its use of symbolic thought and communication, especially language. It didn't just increase its intelligence, our intelligence, but it provided a novel form of referring. That's what I've been talking about here. Symbolic reference is distinctive because symbolic media don't exhibit properties that are similar to or physically related to what they refer to. This requires a shared interpretive habit. So over the course of about 2 million years, in my estimation, our hominid ancestors not only developed this way of communicating slowly but surely, you might say, over the very long period of time, but also their brains were restructured in that process. And much of my work has been trying to figure out what that restructuring process was about. And the way you can think about this is you can think about it this way, that once language-like behavior, and I don't mean that language just popped up suddenly, but once it became critical to our lifestyle, it became effectively a kind of artificial niche into which our brains had to adapt. And I like to compare this to beaver dams. Beavers are aquatic rodents because they build dams. That is, they create the environment that's selected for their behaviors. Similarly, we're the same way, that we've created this way of life in which we're embedded in this world. In our social interactions, they're strongly driven by this symbolic capacity. Symbolic communication, which is epitomized again by language, is in fact intrinsically collective. And that's because the symbolic nature of language, it means that you can only acquire it if you're in a group that speaks that language. The development of human personhood and cognitive functioning fails, in fact. We find that we're very abnormal if we don't grow up in that kind of a context. But this means that the essential aspect of humanness depends on this long-term continuity, which in turn requires the evolution of social emotions. In other words, if we're dependent upon this to even think, for our brains to develop normally, we basically have to be sure. We have to have a bunch of other behaviors that keep us together, keep us, maybe sitting silently while you're listening to somebody ramble on. So what I want to talk about is this transition from social interaction that we see in lots of different species, including our close relatives, versus this kind of intersubjectivity that language gives us. And notice that in each of these groups, what you see is these chimpanzees in each of these groups, bonobos in the top right. They're in contact with each other. They're communicating with each other in complicated ways, emotionally linked and so on. But they don't have the ability to tell each other what happened yesterday or the day before, what they want to do, what they think about their lives, whether they've been picked on 2 days ago by someone else or something like that. Whereas that's what we're doing all the time. We're living, to some extent, in each other's thoughts all the time. That's a very unique feature. We take it for granted because that's our whole life. But in fact, that's a radically unique thing in the natural world. And as a result, when you see this picture in the bottom right, you don't imagine that it's just their physiological interactions that are important. They're tactile interactions. It's that, in fact, they're living in the same world to some extent, the same mental world. And so I call this extended personhood. That what's happened is that the nature of the human person is extended, in fact. It's distributed cognition, so that we use each other's thoughts. In fact, a lot of the thoughts I'm using today were borrowed from maybe Aristotle, maybe from Plato, maybe from people I've met years ago or just a few days ago. The way to think about this is a concept that's often called in philosophy intersubjectivity. We're inside of each other's heads a lot when we interact. And this makes us very different than any other species. We are not individual in the same sense that other species are, and that's quite important. So that we're entangled to some extent in each other. We have kind of an extended personhood. We take this for granted, as I said, and all the things we do morally, ethically, and socially have to do with, in a sense, holding each other responsible for that. To some extent, one of the greatest punishments we can engage in is to just simply isolate someone, not allow them to interact with another person. So this collective intersubjectivity is what I want to talk about, because it turns out to have some really interesting, if you just stand back, think of yourself as a Martian or a chimpanzee looking at us, what would you think about this? Well, because of this referential flexibility, that we alone are capable of sharing the contents of our memories, of our future, and so on. So as a result, we can also collectively do things. We do remarkable things. I mean, everybody's here. This is a collective enterprise, a remarkable thing which came from all parts of the country, maybe from outside of the country. Maybe you drove, maybe you flew. I mean, this is an incredible feat if you think about it in any other context. We just take it, of course, for granted. As a result, I like to describe us as symbolically eusocial. And I'll have to explain what I mean by eusocial in a minute. Eusocial means that we can't live normally. We're not normal unless we're in a social group. And the fact that we rely on being in a social group just to be normal. So symbolic information cannot be acquired or transmitted genetically, but it must be learned. So human mental development depends on being embedded within a social symbolic ecosystem in order to become a person other than just an organism. Humans are, in this sense, obligate symbionts. That is, we're sort of symbionts in this social group. We are like a sort of microorganism in this larger organism. That's what I want to get by here. Get to your, get clear about. So humans are uniquely eusocial. Rather than being reproductively codependent on each other, like ants and bees, for example, we're cognitively codependent on each other. So I like to call ourselves symbolically eusocial. One of the interesting things about eusociality when we look at it in the rest of the animal world, and here I show ants on the left, on the top, worker ants feeding their own eggs to the offspring of the queen. On the bottom, some of these ants are what we call repletes. They are actually become storage vessels for honey. They're called honeypot ants. And they just get filled up with honey to feed the rest of the colony. On the right, I also show another version of this. This is an aphid. Aphids, you've probably had to fight with aphids in your life. Aphids are very interesting. They have endosymbionts living within them. Endosymbiont, endo meaning inside. That is, they have little microorganisms, little bacteria inside that they can't live without because it's what allows them to penetrate into the plant, the enzymes that these guys produce. On the other hand, they have, as a result, recreated a very special part of their stomach just for them. But there's another interesting feature, and that is that the genomes of both the bacterium in their stomachs and the genome of the aphid are quite simplified. That is, they each depend on each other, and in that process, they have given up some autonomy. They don't actually produce everything they need. They require each other. They can't be without each other. So to some extent, they're a larger cooperative species to some extent. And what I want to say is that essentially that's what we are. And there's going to be some consequences of this. Number one, there's a simplification. We think of ourselves as much more complicated. But as we've begun to look at the human genome, there's a lot of simplification in our genome. A lot of things that have just simply wandered off. We don't quite understand why. I like to use this piece from the Phaedo, from Plato, from Phaedrus, in which Socrates is telling somebody, he's talking about the problems with the written word. He says, if men learn this, writing and reading, it will impart forgetfulness in their souls. They will cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written, calling things to remembrance no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks. So he's, in a sense, saying this is a bad thing that happened. But guess what? We know what Plato was thinking about, what Socrates maybe even said. So yes, I don't even know all the phone numbers of my friends any longer. They're all on my cell phone. I'm addicted to it in this sense. But because of it, I can do much, much more. And to some extent, evolution has worked this way, to build complexity by, in a sense, making us dependent in some respects. Simpler, but dependent on a larger group. So this is a kind of a novel convergence. And by this I mean that we now live in this sort of larger mental domain. Most of our lives, you know, as we're walking around even by ourselves, we're thinking about conversations we had or conversations we might have or things we might want to do. Because of this, from writing to print to electronic media, and now, of course, all these electronic media that we have currently, including now the onrush of rapidly complex artificial intelligence systems, which will only get more complex and will only become much more dependent upon them, just like we are on our cell phones. The question is, what kind of a person will we be? What will happen to personhood in this process? It's inevitable, just as it's inevitable that you've forgotten most of the phone numbers of your close friends. And this also has come on the heels of what I call a second human evolutionary transition. I think we're transitioning in the same way that other species have transitioned to a higher order unit by virtue of this, not just by virtue of our communication, but also by virtue of all of our technology. I think the evidence of this is quite clear. It's quite destabilizing. Look at all these graphs. They all have the same shape. That is, they have this kind of hockey stick shape in which they're becoming asymptotic. So many features of our world have suddenly become asymptotic. This is an incredible acceleration, not just an acceleration technologically and communicationally, but in all ways, including what's happening to our planet's atmosphere, what's happening to the oceans, what's happening to most living creatures. The point I want to make is that, of course, this is unsustainable. It means we have to think about what's going on. My assessment is that right now we're in this pink zone. We're in the zone of rapid acceleration. It can't go on forever. So what's going to happen? Well, the natural thing that happens in the natural world, of course, is that things crash. You eat up all your resources, or you spoil your nest, and things go wrong. There may be other possibilities, and that's why this question mark is out there. This is just sort of a rough estimate, somewhere around 2050. I think we're going to figure out that it's already probably decelerating now. And of course, along with this deceleration, I suspect this is one of the reasons we have war, we have a breakdown of governments, a range of things are happening, I think, because that we're experiencing this unsustainable transition. In evolution, and hopefully one of my colleagues will follow up with this story, is that we've seen these kinds of transitions before. At least we see them in hindsight. We call major evolutionary transitions. I like to call them major hierarchic evolutionary transitions because they're to a higher order step. But in this process, what's happening is more and more complex systems are developed, and the parts become just sort of components in the system. So I want to say that we're in a process of such a transition. It's underway now. We're in the midst of it. We can ignore it, or maybe we can gain insight as to how this works. And my suspicion is that we're going to learn about this mostly by looking at biology. Because evolution has gone through these kinds of transitions again and again and again. And of course, it's had exponential growth and crashes also. Those are all possibilities. But there's other ways that we can become higher order groups. And here's a bunch of different ways: symbiosis, commensalism, mutualism, and so on. These are all possibilities. So the question is, can we learn from these evolutionary codependent transitions? Can we learn about how they work, how to deal with where we are, and to somehow gain control of this process? The point I want to make about cognition is that ever since our species began to communicate symbolically. We've been susceptible to this kind of dispersed cognition. We've been susceptible to being part of a larger social group, but this makes us also easy prey to these transitions we're going through right now. Will we become, like the Star Trek Borg? Will we become like a beehive? What do we expect, and how do we deal with it? These are questions that I think we need to think about. And what this is all about, of course, is personhood. This is all about what we are, what makes humans unique. And are we going to transition out of humanness to some extent in this process? It's not clear. But we're clearly in a situation where we're struggling to make sense of it. I like to think about the internet and all of this electronic stuff as a kind of collective unconscious, to use Carl Jung's notion. But it's a collective unconscious that's not just in the human race. It's a collective unconscious in which we've put all of human knowledge out there. And it's even talking to us. But as a result, just as you and I are tweaked and moved and biased by the collective unconscious of the culture we're in, without even knowing what's going on, this is going to be what's going to be happening with this other collective unconscious. The only difference is it's a machine. Only difference is it doesn't engage in thought, in rapture, in feeling, in desire. So, I want to end with two quotes here. One from Irving Good, one of the early computer scientists, worked with Alan Turing. He says, the parts of thinking that we have analyzed completely could be done on the computer. The division would correspond roughly to the division between the conscious and the unconscious minds. And then my good friend Tristan Harris from the Bay Area says this. He says, social media isn't a tool that's just waiting to be used. It has its own goals. It has its own means of pursuing them by using your psychology against you. This is a pretty important piece of news. So, I'm going to use this term from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the concept of the noosphere. That's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with now an idea that was just science fiction a little while ago, that is becoming the situation we are. That's our collective unconscious already. What could possibly go wrong? So with that, let me end and just say, so do a brief ad at the end of this. I'll be making some of this information that 2 weeks from now, we're running a whole conference at Berkeley on the noosphere, in which many of these ideas will be talked about. And just quickly, just take a look at this image right here. If you want to register, here's the website. I'll try to make this available to most people here. For students and educators, it's free, and it will be streamed live. Thank you very much. So while I'm setting up, Jeff, I'll let you talk.
Sorry to run out. A medical emergency to deal with. What an amazing thought that your thoughts, your desires are now being exploited within this system of global information. Your desires, not your genes, but your desires are controlling the fate of your individual and our collective lives. Our next speaker, another member of the project we're working on at Stanford, Boundaries of Humanity, is Jeff Schloss from Westmont College. Jeff holds the T.B. Walker Chair of Natural and Behavioral Sciences at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. And he does a lot of surfing, by the way. That's not written down here, but I think that's why he chose to teach at Westmont. Is that right, Jeff? He holds, so he directs the Westmont Center for Faith, Ethics, and the Life Sciences. In addition to his work at At Westmont, he holds visiting faculty appointments in several programs here and abroad, serves on numerous international editorial and advisory boards related to science and religion, and writes and speaks widely on biology and faith. And Jeff and I have known each other a long time. Besides working together on the project at Stanford, Jeff and I served as co-trustees at Templeton Foundation, for which he made enormous beneficial contributions to their work. So please welcome Jeff Schloss.
It was great to be with you today, and especially great to follow Terry, because I think our thoughts are really concordant. I want to begin by pointing out that in terms of the relationship between personhood and biology, there's a spectrum of perspectives, but two polarized views. One arguing that personhood is ultimately completely reducible to the molecules that make up organic beings, and maybe even for that reason, while it may be heuristically helpful, ontologically non-existent, that personhood is a fiction. And on the other hand, there's the view that it is ontologically real and ultimately transcendent and may be connected to, but it doesn't even require bodies altogether. I'm actually going to avoid that debate and do more of a descriptive approach of how personhood is, for one thing, embodied in human material existence, and secondly, how it emerges from the very processes that gave rise to what Terry already mentioned is a hierarchy of biotic organization. And I want to, so the focus here is the word become flesh, how personhood arises through this biotic hierarchy, culminating so far in symbolic communication. And I want to start with a quote from an essay published in Science over 50 years ago by Michael Polanyi called Life's Irreducible Structures. And Polanyi says, the evolutionary sequence gains a new and deeper significance. We can recognize then a strictly defined progression rising from inanimate levels to ever higher additional principles of life. And by the way, there's been ongoing debate since Darwin about whether there is such a hierarchy, whether evolution is progressive in a meaningful sense, whether it's even discernibly directional. Now, Polanyi's statement here in 50 years ago has been out of sorts most recently, but there's been a return to recognizing certain features of the natural world, which Terry already mentioned, often called major transitions in evolution, sometimes called ETIs or evolutionary transitions in individuality. And a lot of work in this area, and I'll just describe it really quickly. There's a series of transitions, not the emergence of brains or the move from water to land. Those are major transitions too, but a series of thematically consistent transitions, aqueous mixtures to the first protocell, prokaryotic cells, simple cells to eukaryotic cells with compartments and nuclei, single-cell organisms to multicellular organisms expanding in size and cellular diversity within them, asexual to sexual reproduction, and as Terry already mentioned, solitary to eusocial organisms. And then finally, I would never have expected this, but primate to human sociality mediated by symbolic communication. Now, there are certain commonalities to these transitions. First of all, they all involve, sometimes they're called biological big bangs. They all involve the transition to obligate cooperative dependence. Not just cooperating, but obligate interdependence, where a cell in a body can't exist on its own anymore. Also, specialization of labor. This is one reason why it's obligate interdependence, because the kidney cell can't do what the heart cell does. And so there's reliance on one another, and because of this cooperative division of labor, you find life doing things that it couldn't previously do. Changes in information transmission, typified big time with the human use of extrasomatic or symbolic communication. And finally, and importantly, the relinquishment of reproductive autonomy. We don't talk about the fitness of cells in a body, although we can talk about human fitness. All of these things coming together result in the intensification of what we might call the capacities for life. And I just want to highlight two that take the jump to human personhood. And the first one is, if you think about what life does, virtually all those capacities seem to have increased over the history of life. And by the way, by increase, I don't mean getting rid of things that don't do it. I just mean the maximum capacity to do something has increased. For example, to regulate your internal temperature. Here's this graph. To regulate osmotic or other constituents in your body, to perceive the environment, to move through the environment, to respond flexibly to different environmental stimuli. All these things have increased. In a sense, what we have is an increase in agency to respond flexibly in order to maintain constant internal conditions. In fact, that may be one of the ways of construing what life is, controlled disequilibrium with the environment. By the way, in the Christian tradition, Paul exhorts us to be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your minds. And ultimately, when you're ultimately conformed to this world, when your temperature is the earth temperature, when your ionic concentration is the concentration of ions around you, you're a corpse. You're not dead anymore. So, first of all, we've described this notion of the origin of autonomy. Lots of work going on here. The capacities for life seem to have increased. The philosopher Hans Jonas speaks of a greater variety and range of control over itself. In a sense, there's more selfness there. But there's another thing that results. Recent theories in biology called life history theory talk about the allocation of biological energy to massive allocation, for example, on the one hand, to just reproductive output versus allocation to self-maintenance. And what we see is, over the history of life, an increase in what biologists call K life history strategies. Longer life, greater investment in a fewer number of offspring. What we actually see is the evolution of the capacity to care, to invest in one another. So back to Polanyi's quote that we began with, a generation after that, the architects of major evolutionary transition theory, Carl Sagan, for example, says this progress, referring to Polanyi, nowadays described as a series of major transitions, is often due to the emergence of new cooperative units. There's an irony here that I find sublime. While autonomy is relinquished at the lower levels, it's actually enhanced at the higher levels. In a sense, we gain our lives by losing them. The capacity to sense the environment, to control conditions, to sustain organismic integrity, the very qualities we associate with life are elaborated over a series of VTIs. The physician and bioethicist that Bill's worked very closely with, Leon Kass, refers to this as the ascent of soul. And he affirms a hierarchy amongst living things. By the way, this hierarchy has been misused as an excuse for humans to dominate and not care for quote-unquote lower species, but it could just as easily be turned around. We have a greater responsibility to care for those other species. What surprises me is that in many respects, these notions represent, in some ways, a return to the medieval notion of the great chain of being, or scala natura, that involves the lowest physical abiotic elements with an apex in human beings, but not necessarily a culmination. It may keep going in ways that we don't envision. Now, tying this to human personhood, this notion of a human evolutionary transition has become increasingly influential, but also increasingly problem-raising for two reasons. First of all, the human transition involves not just survival that is dependent on others, but also the willingness to sacrifice our own survival for others. It involves altruism. But secondly, and here's what I want to emphasize moving on to the next point, the fact that we can sacrifice ourselves. In other words, we still have selves. We're not cells in a body. We're selves in a community. And we have these selves that we can willingly expend or even sacrifice for one another. That's good news. We have this unique opportunity to love. But it also raises a challenge because we're not naturally necessarily disposed to do this. And humans can pursue their own self-interest in indifference to the welfare of others, which ants in a colony or cells in a body typically don't do. Sometimes they do. When it's cells in a body, we call it cancer, but it's quite rare. And every single individual human being has this possible disposition. So some of the architects of major transition theory, Stephen Stearns, for example, whose work I respect a lot, have raised the question, are we stalled part way through an evolutionary transition? We're obligately codependent, specialization of labor, but we haven't relinquished fully our reproductive autonomy, although we do have relinquished conceptual autonomy. This was foreseen before ETI theory even emerged by the Harvard evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson, who said man has achieved an extraordinary degree of cooperation with little or no sacrifice of personal survival and reproduction. Exactly how he alone has been able to cross this pinnacle is the culminating mystery of all biology. Well, since Wilson, we've done a lot of thought on this. But by the way, long before Wilson, this was already being pointed out by a history of thought. Alexander Pope, in his essay on Man, talks about humans being placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great. And Pascal says, man is neither angel nor brute. And the unfortunate thing is, he who would act the angel acts the brute. And on the other hand, affirming the same tension, Samuel Johnson says, he who would make a beast of himself gets rid of the challenge of being a man. And yesterday, for those who were in Marianne Glendon's and Carter Sneed's talk, they dealt with the same tensions. The disposition to think of our fulfillment in terms of our individual attainment versus, in some sense, being willing to lose ourselves for the good of the whole. And by the way, this notion of an isthmus in a middle state is not just a general characteristic of humankind. Every individual struggles with this. So some of you may not know Carter Sneed's earlier days as kind of a hippie revolutionary. So what do we do here? It's both encouraging and also a little surprising to me that biology is kind of converging on what most of us would have guessed intuitively anyways, that one of the most important cultural innovations and maybe biologically embedded to help us navigate is morality. And one of the first people to think about this was Richard Alexander in his influential book, The Biology of Moral Systems. And Alexander advances the notion of what he calls indirect reciprocity. Every other species who cooperates does it because of genetic relationship, kin selection, or reciprocity, I'll help you if you help me. Alexandra says, no, I'll help Bill if he doesn't help me, because my reputation for doing that might get to Terry. And then Terry might help me just because he thinks he's a good guy. So here's an example. If I give you $1,000 and say, you can keep the $1,000, or you can pay this guy to tutor you to take a test in introductory biology. Give him the $1,000, and if you pass the test, I'll give you $10,000. And who's this guy? Most of you are not going to do it, but if I told you his name is David Haig, chairman of the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology at Harvard, well, then you'll probably do it. And why? Because of his reputation, and ultimately because of language. What I just told you is embedded in language. And the reason I give you this example is David has this wonderful phrase. He says, direct reciprocity takes a face. I have to recognize you as somebody who's been trustworthy before. Indirect reciprocity takes a name. And the reason I bring this up is, first of all, none of this could happen without language. But secondly, and important to the question of personhood, is there's power in being named. Every one of us derives personhood, at least in part, in the matrix of social community where we get a name. And in a sense, this is the word become flesh. There's a word that is embodied in us and confers to us a sense of identity. And by the way, we can remove that. We can dehumanize people by taking away their names. My upbringing was surrounded by people who had numbers tattooed on their bodies, and their names were literally taken away, and they became a number. An interesting question is, do animals do this? We call our dogs by names. We could maybe discuss this. I would argue with Terry that this involves a sign for an objective entity, but not a symbol for a subjective reality. Okay, lastly, there's been an explosion of work on morality besides the naming. And one of the interesting debates is it uniquely human? So the primatologist Franz de Waal says, we have no basic needs that cannot also be observed in our close relatives. And he's observed what he thinks is fairness going on in primates. He's trained capuchin monkeys to give a rock as a token, and then they get food, either a cucumber, which is okay, or a grape, which is really preferred. Now watch what happens here. Gives a rock, and this one gets a cucumber. Okay, gives a rock. And look, this one gets a grape. And his teammates saw it, so he gets a rock. Man, is he excited at a grape? No, he gets a cucumber. Now, this violates notions of rational self-interest. You're better off with a cucumber than nothing. So de Waal, when he says there's no difference, isn't demoting humans, he's elevating primates. But the question is, would the individual sacrifice on behalf of the other being unfairly treated? Am I going to get upset, not when I get unfairly treated, but when you get untreated? And interesting exchange between de Waal and Jerome Kagan, developmental psychologist at Harvard, who says, no, it's more than that. The symbolic private assurance given that one by the self to the self, that one is virtuous is an attractive prize humans seek. That urge is absent in the most cooperative species of other species. So we have this notion that, first of all, humans can conceptualize their self as intentional agents, and they can entertain counterfactuals that I could have done different. That's an amazing part of personhood in itself. It's not clear that any other organism does that, but it doesn't stop there. We can evaluate the choices we did make in light not just of prudential judgments, like, oh, I should have turned right rather than left, but in terms of normative values. That's a special kind of person. And I want to close, Darwin said the same thing. I want to close by observing that that notion of personhood and being named is also affirmed in many religious traditions. So in the tradition of biblical monotheisms, there's this notion of being able to comfort others with the comfort we receive from God. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name, you are mine. Or, the Lord called me from the womb. From the body of my mother, he named my name. There's a dimension of personhood that may emerge in divine commerce, whether it's an illusion or not, the sense that we are named by an entity much greater, much wiser than ourselves. And I'll close with a quote from Pascal. The God of Christians is not a God who is simply the author of mathematical truths or the order of the elements. He's not merely a God who exercises his providence over life and fortunes of men. He's a God of love and comfort, a God who fills the soul and heart of those whom he possesses, a God who makes them conscious of their inward waywardness and of his infinite mercy, who unites himself to their inmost soul, who fills it with humility and joy, with confidence and love, and who renders them incapable of any other end than himself. Thank you.
Wow, what a vision of the history of life. Every once in a while, I ponder the arguments over creation and evolution, and one thing that's very rarely brought out is what regardless of how you see where life came from, it's so remarkable that it could develop in so many ways, unexpected and unpredictable by the stages before. And each stage, as it advances, opens opportunities for new challenges and therefore moves it along further. I mean, for example, when creatures crawled out onto the earth, they needed to regulate their body temperature. And in so doing, they made possible a function of mind that just couldn't happen in a creature that had constant changes in temperature, because the biochemistry wouldn't support the same complexity of memory, for example. And so each stage, there's this biological progressions, challenges and progressions, social progressions, and it seems from that we should start to acknowledge that our current challenges are not just biological, whatever else they are, but just social, they're spiritual as well. So our next speaker is, what's his name? Benjamin Hurlbut. Don't I know you from somewhere? Okay. So Ben is an associate professor in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. He's trained in science and technology studies, that's STS, you know that, with a focus on the history of the modern biomedical and life sciences. And his research lies at the intersection of STS bioethics and political theory. He studies the changing relationships between science, politics, and law in the governance of biomedical research and innovation, examining the interplay of science and technology with democracy, religious and moral pluralism, and public reason. He received his undergraduate training at Stanford University, partly at the classes of his dad. That's interesting. And then did his PhD in history of science at Harvard. Welcome, Benjamin Hurlbut.
All right, so I don't know why I'm on this panel, except that, you know, when your dad tells you to do something, you got to do it. So, and the
First time he's ever agreed to that.
and my aim was to riff on the two previous talks. Boy, am I out of my element. But let me see what I can do. And we're pretty low on time, so I think I'm actually going to truncate this and just sort of, you know, hit some key points so that we have some room for discussion. But this is basically the core of what I want to say. And it draws on a statement by Julian Huxley made about the middle of the 20th century. Julian Huxley was an evolutionary biologist, one of the sort of architects of the modern synthesis, the marrying of the different sort of strands of biological thought in the first half of the 20th century into the form of evolutionary biology that unfolded since. This is a statement about the meaning of what, in effect, he saw as an evolutionary transition in that moment. The discovery, the human discovery of the position of human uniqueness, but also situatedness in an evolutionary, in a trajectory of evolution, of evolutionary development. So evolutionary man can no longer take refuge from his loneliness, from the discovery of this loneliness, by creeping for shelter into the arms of a divinized father figure whom he has himself created, nor escape from the responsibility of making decisions by sheltering under the umbrella of divine authority, nor absolve himself of the hard task of meeting his present problems and planning his future by relying on the will of an omniscient but unfortunately inscrutable providence. So what I want to draw attention to in this talk in particular is this formation of evolutionary man and the corollary notions of responsibility, of present problems, of the exigencies, urgencies, imperatives of being that lonely evolutionary man, and the task of planning for the future. And in particular, I want to focus on the technologies of the task for planning for the future and what they mean for our sense of the person. Okay, so one can take a consequentialist approach to this and look at the way in which, you know, notions of the human become projects of transformation. Here's Robert Sinsheimer, essentially molecular biologist, making a comment in the 1960s about the rising capacities of control in biology and their potential for, you know, consciously perfecting the human species. Here is a more contemporary version of the same sort of thing. But I actually want to take this in a different direction, not look at technologies per se, but look at technologies as sites of imagination, basically, as ways of being, or as sites of dwelling, you might say. So this is Hannah Arendt from the preface to The Human Condition. We who are earthbound creatures and have begun to act as dwellers of the universe. That's the sort of problematic that she's laying out for herself in the inception of that project. But I want to draw in particular attention to acting as dwellers of the universe, what that evolutionary transition means, and not least for how we understand the meaning of that evolutionary transition, and thus who we are and who we seek to make ourselves as a consequence of that imagination. And so put slightly differently, what I want to do is just glancingly explore a few of our very familiar, mundane, even ubiquitous, moral technological grammars that are associated with the concept of Huxley's evolutionary man. In particular, attending to notions of universality, responsibility, progress, and transcendence. And one of the things that I want to do, that I probably won't succeed at, but just let me put it on the table as a kind of provocation, is to challenge the notion that these are individualist conceptions. So they are individuals, as you will see. These are very familiarly individualist conceptions. But actually what I want to see here, what I want us to see, are the imaginations of the collective, the constructions of the collective that are at work in constructions of the individual. And in conjunction, I want to see the relationship between the self and the body that's at work in these constructions of collectives, not so much of individuals, okay? And the ways in which the positing of a particular kind of individual in the name of a particular kind of collective entails, for the most part, forms of disembodiment or dislocation of the self from the body or alienation of body from self as constitutive. That these are expressions of those tasks of the evolutionary man. And one of the examples is a very simple, a ubiquitous example that goes under this important heading, respect for persons. Respect for persons is the first of the 3 Belmont principles, which were articulated in the late 1970s to govern biomedical research. So that site of technological progress, which is made in the name of redeeming human beings from vulnerability and suffering, takes the form of a kind of a technology of autonomy, a technology of the agential self, in which the research object becomes a research subject by participating in a ritual of affirmation of the research project, signing the form. So this is NIH's relatively new digital consent system. So it's as easy as signing for your credit card in the grocery store, which is, it's not very easy. But I like it because it sort of shows, in a sense, almost how trivial this incredibly important, absolutely foundational exercise of the self is to the project of biomedicine. That exercise of the self is it's a kind of an alienation of the body from the self. The body can be taken as object because the self has declared that they are a subject that can authorize the taking of the body as an object. And that hearkening back to what Craig Calhoun said a couple of days ago, there is a sense in which these are roles. These are constitutive roles. One becomes the body that is the site of disease that authorizes the intervention, that is the warrant for the intervention, and also the self that is separate from the body, in effect, that invites the intervention, and becomes the basis for, so there's a particular kind of relationship between particular kind of actions, the patient, the participant, research subject, the research enterprise, and so forth, that is also, sort of centrally figures in notions of what the human needs. I mean, what care for the future requires of evolutionary man. So I want to note this as a kind of a grammar, a kind of moral grammar of alienation that is also that fixes the body in a particular frame and authorizes a particular relationship to the body. And just to see some echoes of this elsewhere, so this is a case, an early case on gestational surrogacy case in California, in which basically the question before the court was is this woman who is pregnant, who is laying claim to parental rights to the child that she is carrying because she entered into a gestational surrogate contract, a mother, or something else? And the court decided that she was an economic agent. She was not a mother. Rather, the self, the right self to see in this configuration was the self that engaged in contract. A contract that's not so different than engaging in an informed consent ritual. And that relationship was necessary to see that relationship, not because she had engaged in contract, not because the body was incidental, but because the sort of right trajectory of evolutionary man, or woman in this case, followed a kind of a trajectory of the emergence of a self that was not a body, but was a economic agent that can engage in certain forms of contractual relations that include, the certain forms of alienation, or at least utilization of the body as a kind of asset. Just to note that we live with these things. This is in the coffee shop that's around the corner from my house. I teach at a big state school full of poor undergraduates who need to find money in all sorts of different ways, and this is one of the ways they find money, right? Because there is a opportunity to engage in this sort of exercise of the self. But I think the key thing to appreciate here is that there's a valorization of that sort of self in the name of a particular sort of collective, okay? And these follow a pattern. I'm going to just skip this in the interests of time and skip ahead to this, which is one of the this was a defining book in bioethics about 20 years ago, in which the notion of the individual, of sort of so-called liberal eugenics, of the individual deciding for themselves, gets put into, it comes to its sort of, its fulfilled realization in a kind of a Rawlsian framework that asks the question about what are the forms of individual agency that are appropriate to justice, to the well-being of the collective. So it's about genetic enhancement, and the sort of answer to the question of genetic enhancement is a sort of Rawlsian approach to distributive justice, to fairness. That in effect, it would be a bad technology if all didn't have access to it, because it would produce forms of inequality that with forms of universal access, you would not have these problems of inequality. In fact, actually, I mean, this is sort of understood as a book about genetic enhancement. Really, this is a book about the further conceptualization of justice and the collective back of it. That the account is an account of the sad fact of natural difference and the imperative of a society to make available to its members those means through which they can erase that difference in bodies, in natural talents, etc., in order to achieve a form of fairness that is justice. So this is a technological reimagination of what justice is and what sort of polity, what sort of selves and what sort of bodies are appropriate to a just world. Just to note that this is an imagination that is in effect enacted, that the sort of idea of the fulfillment of a particular kind of individual comes through this sort of notion. This was from a statement made at the American Society for Reproductive Medicine meeting a few years ago, that the sort of aspiration of that field is to, achieve a future in which all reproduction takes place outside of the human body, not in order to produce some kind of machinery of totalitarian mechanization of procreation, but in order for the self in order for the fulfillment of a particular kind of self that stands in relation to their body in a particular kind of way. This was Marian Glendon referenced this quote, this statement from Planned Parenthood v. Casey in her comments yesterday, I guess. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. A kind of affirmation of a valorization of the project, the pluralistic project of seeking meaning, and then a sort of theory of the right relationship between state, self, and body is articulated in conjunction. Beliefs about these matters could not define the attributes of personhood were they formed under compulsion of the state. There's a particular kind of account of liberty, but it's a kind of account of liberty that takes the body as the field of expression and action, as opposed to itself an element a constitutive element in the question of what forms of life are the appropriate forms of life. I'm basically going to quit there. Part two of this was to talk about science itself as a kind of locus of moral universality. And people who want to can skim this. This is from Julian Huxley's little treatise to the UN about the proposal for a UNESCO, which he, in effect, helped found and led. And why evolutionary humanism is the idiom in which we should understand the human and the common heritage of humankind and the forms of cooperation, the kind of global or international existence appropriate to this sort of this evolutionary, the human that comes after this evolutionary transition. So let me just skip to the end here and point out just three simple things. That what I'm talking about, what I'm inviting us to see, what I'm not really giving you resolution to, but really sort of simply trying to put on the table, is the practical metaphysics of technological transcendence, the ways in which the articulation of the person, of the self, of the collective, lives inside not just the sort of discovery of what and who we are, but the ways in which that discovery gets enacted in particular kinds of projects that are projects of transformation of the self, material transformation of the self, but as importantly, no less importantly, conceptual transformation of the self, which invites the material transformation of the self, even makes the material transformation of the self an imperative. That becomes the sort of evolutionary imperative. And that I don't see how one thinks about these stories in other than theological terms. And yet at stake in them are particular sort of assertions of secularity, like Huxley, like I began with Huxley, a kind of declaration of the ways that one can think and not think about these sorts of questions. And so thinking about the sort of natural theologies that we engage in, explicitly theological or crypto-theological, I think the question comes back down to a question of whether we engage in those as earthbound creatures or as dwellers of the universe. And so the question I want to end on for my co-panelists is that question. How do you think about your own accounts of the human that you have offered? Shall we understand those as exercises of earthbound dwellers or as aspirations to be dwellers of the universe, to stand outside of ourselves and interrogate ourselves? Because it seems to me the stakes of that are quite high. Those are projects of practical metaphysics and not only of self-understanding. Okay, thanks.
Okay, enormously fascinating and challenging questions. We have time for about 10 inquiries in dialogue, so let's just, do you want to respond to each other first, or shall we just ask questions, take questions? Let's take questions. Yes.
Thank you all so much. So the Homer Simpson idea of looking both ways that we could go, right? Which path are we going to take? Envisioning the good, envisioning the bad in ourselves. And thinking about the future of sci-fi, technology, all this stuff that used to just be sci-fi is now right on our doorstep, right? I've watched a lot of sci-fi movies. Most of them are dystopian. I'm having trouble thinking of any that are utopian or in any sense good. Are there, and this is, I guess, a question for everybody, if you can't answer, offline too, are there examples of sci-fi technology where all this is going is the angel route, is a good route, and it's going to lead to a lot of more human flourishing?
Medicine, for example. Okay, go ahead.
I think they're all dystopian. Very few. Now, there's good reason for that, of course. Bad news catches our attention better than good news. You've got to have, a culprit and a solution to make a good story. So part of it has to do with story and the fact that we love stories like this. Part of it is that we don't have very good vision yet. And I think one of the real challenges is that we're, as you say, we're right in the middle of it. A major transition is going on right around us. We're in it. And if we don't have a good vision, then we will have a dystopian future.
I'll give you an example of a proposal that is explicitly utopian. Since we've made this transition, but it may be incomplete, we are all reliant on each other, but any one of us can defect. And because of technology, the potential cost of that defection is much higher. So we have people now going in with automatic weapons and killing many, many people, and who knows what future damage can be done by single individuals. It's a reflection of the tragedy of the commons. So there's a proposal that's seriously on the table because of the potential harm that anybody can do, that mandated should be moral AI and implants into the brain. I think it's a serious proposal that has come out of Oxford recently. We all know that when we use a GPS for locations, at least me, my geographic acumen decreases. I think that's a profoundly dystopian proposal, so that even the most consciously moral ones can have dystopian impacts.
So just one quick and maybe cryptic word in response to this. We do presence by imagining futures in many important respects. And so the question about utopian or dystopian, the question about the goods and bads, the future goods and bads, are questions about dispositions, postures in the present. They are the what shall be, what will be questions are what should we do questions. And yet we don't attend to that very well, particularly in the domain that you're asking about. We don't see that, and yet we do act on the basis of it. And it seems to me that it's crucial that we come to see that we act on the basis of it. For example, and Terry, take issue with this, for example, the